Okay, I think we'll begin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this exciting lecture today. My name is David Albertson. I'm a professor here at USC in the Religion Department in Dornsife. I'm also the executive director of the Nova Forum for Catholic Thought, which is sponsoring today's talk, along with our co-sponsor, the Thematic Option Program at USC. This event is made possible by the generous support of the John Templeton Foundation, grant number 62372, in Lumine, supporting the Catholic intellectual tradition on campuses nationwide. Our guest today, Peter Harrison, is an internationally renowned historian of early modern Europe, making his first visit to USC. I hope you can all return tomorrow to join us for a special symposium. We'll start in the same room tomorrow, Friday at 10 a.m. We'll have coffee at 9:30, and you can hear more from Professor Harrison, and this time in dialogue with 5 USC professors from Dornsife, who will be sharing about their latest research on religion and science. Peter Harrison is Professor Emeritus of History and Philosophy at the University of Queensland and a Professorial Research Fellow at the University of Notre Dame in Australia. For many years, he was the Andreas Idreos Professor of Science and Religion at the University of Oxford. He has published extensively on the philosophical, scientific, and religious thought of the early modern period, especially the historical relations between science and religion. His 12 books include his Gifford Lectures, published as The Territories of Science and Religion in 2015, and his most recent book, just out this year, Some New World, Myths of Supernatural Belief in a Secular Age. I hope you can visit our website if you're interested at novaforum.org or follow us on Instagram at novaforum. Professor Harrison's lecture today is titled The Battle of Science and Religion, New Perspectives on a Troubled Relationship. Please join me in giving a warm USC welcome to Peter Harrison.
Well, thanks, David, for that warm welcome, and thanks to the Nova Forum for sponsoring this event. Thanks to you for coming. It's great to see you all. David didn't tell me that I would be subjected to the cruel and unusual punishment of being the only person in the room who's not eating pizza, but enjoy it, and hopefully you'll enjoy the talk as well. As you'll see, I'm talking about the battle between science and religion, or the imagined battle between science and religion. I'm going to talk about it under these 4 headings. First up, I'm going to say something about, what's the contemporary status? Why do people think science and religion are in conflict? And who are the people who say that science and religion are in conflict? I'm particularly interested in what I think is a very common view, that present conflicts between science and religion are reflective of a long-standing conflict throughout history. And here I think the standard view is that science and religion, in a sense, have always been opposed by virtue of their intrinsic nature. And that if we look at the course of history, what's happening is in that struggle that really religion is increasingly the loser and science increasingly the winner. And what I want to suggest to you is that that certainly is false as a historical account, and most historians would agree with that, and that to some extent this also helps us understand some aspects of the conflict as it manifests itself in the present. So that's why I'll be talking about, well, what do historians think about this? And then if historians don't think there was a perennial conflict between science and religion, how did the idea of this conflict arise, and why does it persist? And they're points 3 and 4. So to the first of these, I just want to start with just a few statistics to give us a sense of, well, what the state of play is. Now, Elaine Eklund is a sociologist at Rice University who does lots of interesting work, lots of interesting statistical work in attempting to establish what people's attitudes to science and religion actually are. And you can see for yourselves there what the pattern looks like. Now, Elaine is very keen for the conflict between science and religion to be lessened and resolved. So she takes a rather a more sanguine view, I think, than perhaps the stats justify. But just to rephrase what she has said, more than half of evangelicals think science and religion are not complementary. And overall, in the US, 62% of Americans don't think that religion and science are complementary. Okay, so that's the pattern here. We find something similar in other European countries. So in the UK, we find that the pattern is even more pronounced, that the British public, by a factor of 2 to 1, thinks science and religion are incompatible. And indeed, the proportion of people who think they are strongly incompatible is something like more than 1/5, much greater than those who think they are strongly compatible. So the UK, of course, is more secularised than the US, and so we'd expect there to be this greater polarisation. And I think if we had the stats for France, for example, it would be similar or even more pronounced. So that's the pattern. People think that science and religion are in conflict. Why do they think that? Well, one reason is that there are opinion leaders out there telling them that science and religion are in conflict. And Richard Dawkins, who made a lot of noise about this a decade or so ago, would be one example. Richard Dawkins is a popular science writer. He once held the chair for the public understanding of science at Oxford, and he is a strong advocate that science and religion are in conflict, and that indeed science should exercise its authority over religion and vanquish religion and get it to move on. And the reason he thinks this is that he believes that science and religion are in competition to explain the same kinds of things. But science gives you the right explanation and religion gives you a kind of fantasy, false explanation. And really, in Richard Dawkins' view, once we're all grown up, we know that science is the activity and discipline that provides us with the answers to the questions that religion asks but cannot answer adequately. So here, because science and religion compete for the same explanatory territory, the conflict is kind of going to be inevitable, right? And there's going to be one winner. And Richard Dawkins hopes that that winner is going to be science. To move to this country, it's Sam Harris. We're going back some way with this book, The End of Faith. But Harris has a similar view. In this popular book, The End of Faith, he tells us that the conflict between science and religion is inherent. That is to say, by their very nature, science and religion must necessarily come into conflict with each other. And what that means is if you put them together, you end up with a zero-sum game. And what he means by a zero-sum game is that the success of religion can only come at the cost of science, and that the success of science necessarily means the diminution of the influence of religion. So people think science and religion are in conflict. There are leading voices out there telling them that science and religion are in conflict, and they're in conflict because they're in competition to explain the same things. And more recently then, in addition to these two books by Dawkins and Harris, we have Jerry Coyne, the evolutionary biologist from University of Chicago, his 2015 book, I think, again, Why Science and Religion Are Not Compatible. And for Jerry Coyne, science is all about facts and religion all about fanciful faith. The Canadian sociologist Eve Gingra, Science and Religion, an Impossible Dialogue. Science and religion, he says, can't even talk to each other because they're so radically different in the approaches that they take. Just one more example from more recent history. The television series Cosmos, hosted by Neil deGrasse Tyson. And here the idea when he says, when knowledge conquered fear, he's talking about the scientific revolution of the 17th century. When modern science was born, we have these leading figures like Descartes, Newton, Boyle, that gang. And what these people represent, he believes, is genuine knowledge conquering a fearful attitude to how we understand the natural world. Now, just a couple more examples of where this conflict manifests itself, and I'll go on to talk about what historians think about this. But this strikes me as a very interesting source of the conflict myth. Introductory textbooks in the social sciences will often rehearse this story about a conflict between science and religion. So just to give you one example from one of these texts, here's the story about, well, when Copernicus argued that the sun was the center of the solar system, this started then the beginning of a conflict between science and religion. The Enlightenment came along, and that was on the side of science and reason, and religion is kind of on the losing end of this ongoing conflict. So if the social scientists talk to their neighbours in the history department, they wouldn't be putting this kind of stuff in their introductory textbooks. But part of the formation of undergraduate students in the social sciences is actually to be inculcated with these kinds of stories about the past, about how science and religion come into necessarily in conflict. And Copernicus is a touchstone. Copernicus and Galileo, as we'll see, are a touchstone for this. Now, it has to be said, in addition to people telling them that science and religion are in conflict, there are contemporary examples of science and religion being in conflict. And in this country, the most conspicuous example of that would be young earth creationism, which is to say religiously motivated anti-evolutionism. And that looks very much like a conflict between science and religion. And I think the tendency is for people to look at that tension between evolutionary thinking and certain religious conceptions of human origins and say, well, this must be characteristic of the history of science and religion going all the way back. Now, there are a couple of things to say on this score. Firstly, if you look at that, cartoon, and this is kind of nuancing why this is not purely about science and religion. The real concern, I think, of young earth creationists is actually this sort of range of moral issues that you see in the balloons up there. And so then part of the motivation is to do with their concern about moral questions, which they think evolution necessarily gives you a kind of bad take on, right? So they're fairly conservative moral positions, but their argument is that if it weren't for evolutionary theory, people would not be holding these moral positions. So what appears to us as a kind of science-religion conflict on the surface of it, at a much deeper level, it's about fundamental moral questions for which science and religion kind of become the stalking horses, or evolutionary theory kind of gets the blame for having produced a modernity that has moral positions that conservative Christians don't really like. The other way of nuancing this is to say that because young earth creationists have their own version of science, they have a kind of creation science. In a sense, they have a high view of science. They're not against science, they're just against particular modern versions of science. So that's another way of nuancing it. I think the other reason people find the science-religion narrative plausible, in addition to these contemporary instances of it, is that there seem to be famous examples of it in the past. And of course, the most famous of all is Galileo's famous collision with the Inquisition in the early 17th century. And famously, Galileo sought to defend the views of Copernicus, who argued for a sun-centered rather than an earth-centered cosmos. As the story goes, the Inquisition came down fairly hard on this view, and in 1632, Galileo was condemned to house arrest as a consequence of teaching the Copernican view, which turned out to be right in the end. And this is very often presented as a kind of paradigmatic or emblematic instance of science-religion conflict, and is thought to typify the relations of science and religion from, in a sense, the beginning of history to the present. Now, there's much more to be said on the Galileo affair, which I won't go into, but I'll go into it a little bit. Let me say this, that primarily this affair was to do with two competing scientific theories. And the interesting thing is that all of the scientific evidence at the time was in favour of an earth-centered cosmos. Galileo didn't have the science, he didn't have the arguments, he didn't have the physics. He put together arguments that were false, and the Catholic Church, in essence, simply backed the scientific consensus at the time, right? So the Catholics were actually in favour of science insofar as they were saying to Galileo, this is what the consensus of your colleagues is telling us. The evidence is just not there. And interestingly, the strong evidence for the motion of the Earth didn't come till the 19th century, okay? Newton provided the physics that made it at least plausible that the Earth was in motion, and I think things really took off from there. So I could give you a whole lecture on the Galileo affair, but I won't. I just want to say it looks like a science-religion conflict. It's far more complicated than that when we go down. Okay, but this, I guess, is a way of leading into what do historians say about the thesis of a long-standing competition between science and religion. And in essence, what historians say is that the situation is complex. That's our first point here. And that although there are flashpoints when it appears that there are conflicts between science and religion, these do not constitute a typical pattern. And indeed, they are counterbalanced by the fact that there are many times where religion actually provides support for scientific conceptions in various ways. And I'm going to talk about that on those 3 points below: motivation, social legitimation, and presupposition. But let me just appeal to authority here on this question of complexity. And this goes right back to historians, going back 30, 40 years. Here we are in 1986. I haven't done the maths, but this is a collection of essays by the University of Wisconsin historians of science, David Lindberg and Ronald Numbers. It's a collection of essays by historians of science, and here's the take-home message. Every chapter, let me put the take-home message up so you can take it home. Every chapter portrays a complex and diverse interaction that defies reduction to simple conflict or harmony, right? That's pretty much the standard view amongst historians. My predecessor at Oxford, John Hedley Brooke, wrote this now a classic work in the field of science and religion, and he argues precisely the same thing and demonstrates it conclusively in this wonderful book. Serious scholarship in the history of science, what does it show? General theses are difficult to sustain. The real picture is that it's complicated, right? And this is, historians will tell you this for pretty much any period of history. It's really complicated. Okay, so from that time on, we've had any number of books by historians arguing precisely this. It's complicated. Theological considerations actually play a positive role very often in scientific activity. And this is just to give you an example of just how many books there are on this theme. The same, it turns out to be true for not merely Western Christianity, but other religious traditions as well. And so historians and thinkers from these other traditions have also made the same point, that if you look at the facts, the notion of conflict just doesn't stack up. So the question, so historians having sort of beaten their heads against a brick wall for something like 3 decades on this question, because clearly this story about complexity and the falsity of the conflict narrative hasn't got through, they've started to wonder, well, maybe what has to be explained now is why does this story persist in the present? And these 2 works from the last 5 years or so actually attempt to address that question. Given what historians have been saying for the past 30 years or so, why is it the case that this myth about an enduring conflict between science and religion is so difficult to dislodge from people's thoughts? And just before I go on to address some of the positive aspects of science and religion, let me just point to this recent book. If you're interested in a non-specialist, quick and dirty account of, as it says here, the entangled histories of science and religion, this book by Nick Spencer which came out, I think, 2 years ago, is a terrific, approachable text on the historical relations between science and religion, written not by a historian of science, but by someone who's read all of the historians of science and who, as far as I can tell, got the story very much right. Okay, what I want to do now is to move on to say, not merely can we say that the conflict myth is wrong, and not merely can we say that the story of the history is complex, but that there are moments and times in history when religious considerations, for various reasons, have had a positive impact on the emergence of scientific conceptions. And I want to talk very briefly about motivations. And here the point is that key figures in the period of the scientific revolution, which is to say the 17th century, when modern science, experimental science, gets up and running for the first time, key historical actors are motivated by religious factors, and they say they're motivated by religious factors. So Johannes Kepler, really important figure, in my view, more important than Galileo. He's the guy who discovers the 3 laws of planetary motion that Isaac Newton then subsumes into his single law of universal gravity. Okay, so he discovers the elliptical orbits of the planets, and he comes up with the mathematical formulae that describe how those orbits are going to happen. It's brilliant work of both mathematics and observational astronomy. But Kepler says, essentially, I see this scientific astronomical work as intrinsically theological, right? And he invoked God on numerous occasions. So God is praised through work in astronomy, says Johannes Kepler. Moving to England, to the scientist Robert Boyle, who's one of the fathers of experimental philosophy or experimental science. And Boyle says this, that the whole goal of scientific activity is to display to people the perfections of God in the creation. And the point here, he will talk about scientists as philosophers, as priests of nature, because they're displaying aspects of God's nature through their scientific activity. So these are just 2 examples, and I have to say not all of the scientists of the 17th century are this explicit, and not all of the scientists of the 17th century, I think, have this degree of religious motivation. But key figures do have this religious degree of motivation, and unless there's some weird cognitive dissonance going on, clearly for them, there's no conflict between their science and the practices, their religious commitments. And indeed, the same would be true for those religiously practicing scientists in the present. And there have been a succession of those since these early founders. Okay, so that's just one easy way of thinking about how science and religion interact in positive ways. Let me move on to this social legitimation. This is a kind of complicated one, but I'm sure you'll get it. And if we don't, well, we can talk about it in the Q&A. But religious legitimation goes to this question. This is a famous question in the history of science put by the sinologist Joseph Needham. And the question is, why science in the West in the 17th century and nowhere else? Okay. And the nowhere else we need to qualify, because in a sense, we do have science in China, right? And science technologically is ahead of the West in the Middle Ages. And yet the West overtakes and does something very special, okay? So here's the question. What is it that gives science its boost in the West compared to other cultures? And we can think about other cultures as not only China. Medieval Islam had a very sophisticated scientific culture. Ancient Greece had a very sophisticated scientific culture. But the historical pattern we see in these places is a kind of boom-bust pattern, right? We have an efflorescence of scientific activity, but it doesn't consolidate. And so the distinctive thing about the West is not just that we have science, but science occupies such a central place in our society, and that is culturally unique. Now, I was just talking to David before the lecture, and we were bemoaning the humble place of humanities subjects in big universities like this, which are dominated by STEM. Now, in a sense, This is the legacy of science being legitimated to the hilt. This is, I say, very distinctive. What these other cultures decided was that actually there are more important things than science. They have other priorities, okay? So here's the question. Why did the West decide to back science, push it into the centre of the culture, to some extent at the cost of other things, right? And the answer here is it's to do with the set of values. And some of those values are Christian religious values, okay? So to go back to the question, why do we have this exceptional situation in the West that escapes the boom-bust pattern of other cultures, moves science to the centre? This is the question of its social legitimation. There are arguments that this is a project, a way of knowing that has great legitimacy. And at its origins, it appealed to religious considerations to establish its legitimacy and establish its central place in culture. So here's one example from Francis Bacon, who was a philosopher and thinker from the early 17th century in England. His ideas provided essentially the philosophy that the Royal Society, the very first society that first scientific society that kicked off in England in the 1660s. This is where it got its kind of rationale from. But what Bacon says is this: he talks of the Christian story of the fall and says what happened in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve did the wrong thing. They suffered a moral loss, but they also suffered a loss of an encyclopedic knowledge of the natural world. Adam, he argued, and this was the common view at the time, had an encyclopedic knowledge of nature and had perfect control over all of the natural world. There were no wild animals, no weeds, no mosquitoes, none of that nasty stuff. Adam had dominion over nature, but he lost that as a consequence of the fall. Now, says Bacon, the whole goal of religion is to re-establish those moral losses. We lost our moral integrity. We lost our capacity just to do good things. Religion helps us re-establish those moral losses. And the point of the sciences working alongside religion is to establish our physical control over nature, our knowledge of nature. And so the scientific enterprise for Bacon has this redemptive capacity, a religious capacity to work alongside religion to restore human beings, partially at least, to the perfection that they once had in their original Edenic state in the Garden of Eden. So that's one example of how an appeal to a set of religious values to argue that science is a redemptive activity, and Bacon will also say science is also the outworking of Christian charity insofar as that it helps us promote human welfare. Okay, so these aspects then are a key part of the religious legitimation of sciences and explains the distinctive path that science takes in the West, but nowhere else. Now, just so that you know, I'm not the only person making this argument. Here's my colleague, English but long-time Antipodean. Part of the distinctive success of science at the level of legitimation and consolidation. So here are those key aspects of what's distinctive about what's going on in the West. It's not a separation of religion, as we often tend to think, but they actually come together. So the very interesting point here is that science or natural philosophy and theology tended to be quite distinct in the Middle Ages. Part of the process of making science socially legitimate, this new science, was to bring them together. And so scientists, many of them were like Bacon, they were kind of amateur theologians. And that's a kind of combination that you don't see. It's unprecedented, okay? So that's the second point. If we talk about some of the positive ways in which religion impacts on science, clear in the motivations of the key figures, but at a broader scale, what's distinctive about the West we can explain in terms of an appeal to religious values to give science at its origins social legitimacy. And one last one? Yeah, presuppositions. Okay. Presuppositions, very important. Presuppositions, and I'm going to talk here about laws of nature. One of the distinctive things about the experimental sciences of the 17th century is their appeal to laws of nature. And to cut a long story short, the preceding science of Aristotle, which dominated the medieval university curriculum, and indeed the curriculum of the universities into the 17th century, Aristotle's view of science was that how we explain what's going on in the world is we give an account of the internal properties that things have, their capacities and powers. So things move because of an internal capacity to move, okay? Things have the chemical qualities they have on account of their internal properties or essences or natures, right? Now, in the 17th century, that view that things were to be explained in terms of their internal properties is overturned by a view that they're to be explained in terms of laws, and those laws govern their motions. And in essence, things have no internal properties. They're essentially everything in the world, everything in the universe is made up of inert particles that have no capacity to do anything at all. The only reason they do something is because God acts upon them, and he acts upon them in ways that are mathematical and lawful. And so when we study motion, what we're studying is the way in which God has instantiated particular mathematical laws. So here's Robert Boyle making precisely that claim, that laws of motion, they don't spring from the internal properties of things, but they depend on the will of God. Now, the originator of this conception of laws of nature, you may be surprised to them, was Descartes, right? Descartes invents this notion of laws of nature, and then his colleagues across the channel appropriate it and turn it into this powerful scientific model. But the notion that there are mathematical laws of nature is a key proposition of natural science. Originally, it has this theological origin. God instantiates these laws. And as Newton will say in the Principia, the reason we have to investigate the natural world empirically is that God could have imagined any number of ways of ordering the natural world. We can't intuit rationally what they are. We need to explore the world empirically to find out what laws God has chosen to stamp on his natural world. And thus Newton will say, so the business of true philosophy, and he means natural philosophy, which is science, okay, is to inquire after the laws that the great creator actually chose to instantiate or put into place in the world, not those that he might have. And what follows from this is a very interesting conception of nature, that the whole of nature really is God just doing stuff. So Samuel Clarke, who's probably unfamiliar to you in a way that Newton is not, he was a Newtonian philosopher theologian. There was a famous quarrel between Leibniz and Newton, the German philosopher Leibniz and Isaac Newton. And Samuel Clarke went into bat for Isaac Newton. But he makes it very explicit that once you understand laws of nature in this theological way, what you understand the natural world to be is nothing other than God doing stuff in this lawful way. And so there really is no inherent power of nature. There really is no nature itself. Okay, all you've got is God doing stuff. That view of the laws of nature persists into the 19th century. And so John Herschel, who was probably for the early 19th century, the leading authority on the philosophy of science, leading authority on the nature of science, just rehearses this view from the 17th century that originates in Descartes, gets expression in Newton, and here it is, it's still there. And again, give you another figure you probably haven't heard of, although this guy invented so many scientific terms that you would use all the time. So cathode and anode, and they're the only two I can think of, but I assure you there's a lot. Anyway, he's running the same line about laws of nature, that when we study the natural world, what we're studying is God's laws. Okay, so that really takes us to a third way in which religion has this kind of positive impact by providing theological underpinnings. Now, interestingly, what happens in the second half of the 19th century is that naturalizing scientists like Thomas Henry Huxley, who was Darwin's sort of publicist, he just simply redescribes these laws as nature, right? So he just does away with the God bit and says, well, we're just going to keep the laws of nature. We're not going to worry about any of the rest. And that essentially, I think, is the situation that we're in today. So if you're wondering, well, what happened to this deeply theological account? It simply was just washed out by secularizing scientists in the second half of the 19th century. But the question then is why we still think there would be laws of nature if we're no longer perhaps subscribing to the original theological point. Okay, moving on. Oh, how did the conflict thesis arise? Well, we've got about 5 minutes to go through this, and it's as most things in history, it's complicated. I actually think that the Protestant critiques of Catholicism are going to be part of this, and you don't have to read that whole quote if you don't want to. I'll give you the bottom line here is that what Francis Bacon, who we've already encountered, argues is if you look at history, we have a Reformation that reforms religion. That's the Protestant Reformation. And Providence decreed that we'd also have a reformation of science at the same time. So Bacon links the Protestant Reformation, when we have the beginnings of this Protestant revolt against Catholicism. He argues that science it's a similar kind of thing, and there are good reasons that he might think that. But then what will happen is that Protestants will also seize on something like the Galileo affair and say, aha, the Catholic Church has always been against science. And this starts then not as a kind of science versus religious thing, but as a confessional conflict with Protestant apologists using this to argue that science and Catholicism are opposed to each other. Now, what happens then is that in the Enlightenment philosopher will simply take this Protestant view and they will generalize it. And they say, it's not just the Catholics, by the way, it's all of you lot who are against science. And so you get this generalized notion of a science and religion that's part of one strand of the French Enlightenment. Okay, so you've already got the beginnings of a conflict story in this famous document of Enlightenment called the French Encyclopedia, authored by Diderot and D'Alembert, okay? And here they want to argue, well, religion is supposed to be about faith, but, and here's the first use that I've come across of the Galileo affair as exemplifying a universal science-religion conflict. So it's part of the rhetoric of Enlightenment thinkers. And here's another example. Now, this is an interesting one, the idea of a flat Earth, which is a complete myth. No one ever believed in a flat Earth, really. But you get the story that there's religious opposition, for example, to Columbus sailing because he's going to sail off the end of the world. This is incorporated into the mythology of a science-religion conflict. And so the idea of a flat Earth kind of becomes a shorthand for, religious ignorance about the true scientific state of affairs. Now, combined with that, we get a particular theory of progress. And so Condorcet, another one of these Enlightenment thinkers, will say Christianity sort of kills off science. And so you have this notion that you want to know what happened to Greek science. It wasn't they didn't socially legitimize and consolidate. Christianity killed it dead. And that then becomes, I think, a very powerful part of a long historical story. And just to say about the significance of these Enlightenment ideas, and this, I think, explains why the conflict myth persists in the present. From Dan Edelstein, this book from a decade or so ago on the Enlightenment. So the conflict story, he says, is central to the Enlightenment self-conception, and the Enlightenment then becomes part of a modern self-understanding. We think of ourselves as heirs to the Enlightenment, as rational human beings, and therefore as rational, enlightened human beings, we go for science and we don't go for religion. Now, Edelstein says it's a myth. He's right. But you can't tell that to these guys who still buy the Enlightenment's own PR story of itself, okay? So again, these exemplify This is why it's so difficult to get the message through, because we still have very influential thinkers pushing essentially what was 18th century Enlightenment propaganda. Okay. Two more things to the persistence of the myth. And here, I think, in the birth of the social sciences, once you get a progressive understanding of how our phases of knowledge move through something like this, right, inevitably then religion and theology looks like something you need to leave behind if you're going to advance to a higher scientific stage of thinking. And Auguste Comte was the kind of father of the social sciences. This progressive story worked its way into the DNA of the social sciences. And I think the quotes from those textbooks I gave you earlier indicate that actually it's still there, right? It's still there as part of the sub-story of, we now have a scientific way to talk about human beings. We don't need these outmoded religious ways. And just to give you one further example, so here, this guy, the father of sociology in America, very influential. Again, we now have a mode of explanation that's better than religious explanation. And there, again, the idea of competing, science and religion competing for the same explanatory space, but religion being the one that doesn't do it very well. Okay. So look, I have a few more slides, but I think we might just cut to one last slide, I think, where we see, I think, the one of the definitive versions of the conflict story emerging, and that's in this work by the Anglo-American chemist John William Draper, who, as you can see, wants to say that the history of science is just a narrative of conflicting powers. He's still got this notion that the Roman Catholic Church is the kind of worst exemplification of opposition to science, but nonetheless his title is about religion and science. This was an enormously influential book. Jerry Coyne still cites it. It was translated into many different languages, and gave what purported to be historical instances of science and religion conflict. John William Draper, who was the first president of Cornell, wrote a similar book, similarly influential, lots of historical episodes that purport to be about the conflict between science and religion. And so these two figures, Draper and White, kind of crystallize these Enlightenment conceptions of a conflict between science and religion, fill it out with historical detail. And as I say, I think were very influential in forming 20th and 21st centuries conceptions of science and religion conflict. So to sum up then, I'm going to skip these guys, unfortunately, because they are relevant, but I want to get us to Q&A. So to sum up, I think the conflict thesis is an idea that won't die. But as we've seen in the creation science opposition to evolution, there's a significant moral component in what looks like science-religion conflict. I think the reason it persists is we think of ourselves as rational, enlightened individuals, and insofar as we do so, this conflict myth story is important to our identity. It's also, I think, important to the kind of boundary policing work that's to do with that modern science operates with. So when modern science gets defensive, it puts the barriers up. It's a key part of modern naturalism, which I haven't talked about. Actually, we might talk more about this in the seminar tomorrow. And then finally, I think that this story of science-religion conflict is routinely incorporated into the founding myths of the sciences and the social sciences in particular. So let me just finish with this. Here's the problem for us, that history will never beat myth, and I'll stop there. So I think that we have time for questions. Is that right,
Yes.
David? And we have a roving microphone here. So I'm happy to field questions from anyone at this point.
First of all, thank you for the talk. I'm sure there's been some scholarship trying to dispel the myth of this like long-standing conflict. What are some of the biggest reasons you think nowadays that scholarship and that research, including some of your stuff, is not pushing higher up in circles, academic circles, as it could be or should be?
Yeah. So look, that's a great question. As I say, but historians of science have been scratching their heads about this for a while. I think I've hinted at some of the reasons, but one I haven't mentioned is that our disciplinary specializations are so tight these days that, for historians, it's very difficult to read outside your period, far less outside your discipline. And I think that the same is true for anthropologists and people in the hard sciences, that they're so busy doing the specialized work that they're trained for, that it's just the exception rather than the rule that people would read outside their field. So that's one aspect of it. But as I say, I think it clearly we're operating here at the level of we're not just appealing to rational argument. So there's something more going on that I think is to do with identity. But you see this all the time, and I mean this in this country, it seems to become increasingly difficult to have rational conversations about anything. And let me not go down that rabbit hole. Let me come back to something that I think there's much more concrete. The public understanding of science. So what we saw during the pandemic was it was very difficult for scientific community to communicate what they thought was true, partly because the science was shifting at the time. But people who were resistant to vaccines, for example, what sociological phenomenon emerged was that when you tell people the facts about the efficacy of vaccines, and if they start from a position of not believing that, you reinforce the false view they have by presenting them with the facts, right? So the rhetoric of persuasion has to be far more subtle, right? And I'll just leave that as an observation. But so I think there are a number of reasons for it. I think it's a great question, and we're still working on it.
Much for a really illuminating talk, especially the Protestant genealogy of the Catholic versus science debate. It's really interesting. And I'm wondering why you think that Protestants in the Reformation found themselves more compatible with science than Catholicism. My inkling is that a lot of these narratives that take sort of Protestant roots of secularization turn on Reformation debates around the Eucharist and see the shift from real presence to symbolism in the sacraments as underwriting everything from mathematical logic to semiotics. But I'm curious why you think as they were able to create this antithesis between Catholicism and science, how Protestantism was able to align itself with American.
Yeah. That's a good question, Matt. I think, one of the reasons is they kind of had this emblematic thing with Galileo that was just too good to let go, right? And they hit that really hard. And there's this story about John Milton going to Italy and visiting Galileo, and he says, I visited Galileo, a prisoner of the Inquisition. So he's talking it up. And Protestantism has a conception of itself here as intellectually liberating, and they contrast Catholicism with this. And the Inquisition provides them with numerous, examples. So that's one part of it. Look, I think the other one, and I haven't developed it, I talk about this a little bit more in the new book. I think part of it is also to do with Protestant attitudes to miracles. And for Protestants, the age of miracles was over. The Protestants thought miracles had stopped in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Catholics had their contemporary miracles going on. And so this was a point of difference where Protestants thought they could really score some points. And so the argument was that Catholicism was essentially superstitious to its core, and that Protestantism had this kind of more rational approach. And so Protestants wouldn't buy into the notion of miracles, whereas the Catholics did, and Protestants divided history, miracles here but not here for Catholics. And that fitted also neatly with this Protestant dividing of history into the Enlightened Protestant. And I think in the Enlightenment thinkers appropriate this Protestant division of history, and that's where you get these, and therefore you can get these progressivist notions up and running. So it's a kind of complicated story, but I think there's some of the elements to it. Got one down here. Oh, I see.
Thanks very much for the talk. I wanted to look at the religion side of the science versus religion conflict in Galileo's case. Because as I read that, he was really convicted for violating an institutional edict of the church, the 1616 commission that found the Copernican opinion to be false philosophy and heretical theology. And the thought was that he published in 1632 the two world systems in defiance of that order. So in a certain way, the religion part really was represented a lot more in the question of the institutional authority of the church. And in part, that's what the commission in 1992 appointed by Pope John Paul II, who said, well, Galileo was right in theology after all, and withdrew finally. You don't want to rush into these things,
Right.
but withdrew this finding of a vehement suspicion of heresy. So does that read fit with your reading of the situation?
Yeah, I think it does. So look, you're exactly right. I mean, there's this in 1616, the commission said to Galileo, don't teach the Copernican model as physical truth. You can teach it, interestingly, as a model, as a fiction that gives us prediction, but don't teach it as the truth. Now, in 1632, when he published the dialogue, it was pretty clear that and so the 1632 trial was essentially not about the substance, but about whether he'd actually contravened the 1616 injunction not to, right? So that's the backstory there. So it was, in that sense, it was about authority. Look, I think the authority plays in another way. So first of all, you're quite right to say there were two elements. It was nonsense in natural philosophy, but it was also formally heretical. So there was a religious aspect to it, right? But Catholicism, Bellarmine in 1616 had said, we're going to follow the Augustinian principle that if you have a demonstrated truth of natural philosophy, we'll reinterpret Scripture, right? And that Augustine had said this. Galileo himself appeals to it in his letter to the Grand Duchess Christina. So the church had said, you give us the proof, we'll change our interpretation, but it's heretical because it's not consistent with the interpretations. And crucially, you don't have the proof. And that was the thing. He didn't have the proof. He thought he had a proof from Tyres that was completely wrong. And one other thing on the authority, in his letter to the Grand Duchess, where Galileo sets out to defend his approach, what he does is he looks at these passages of Scripture and says, we can interpret them this way. Now, that's fatal in a context where the Catholic Church says in Trent, we are the people who determine who interprets Scripture, not mathematicians out there, and certainly not you Protestants. So when Galileo says, I'm going to show you how these passages are to be interpreted, I mean, you're right, it goes against the authority of the church, but in a context where this is exactly what Protestants are doing, it raises red flags in a way that Copernicus never did really in the middle of the 16th century. So thanks for your question. It gave me a chance to say more about Galileo, which I'm always happy to talk about.
Also on the topic of the power of the Catholic Church, obviously we can't rewrite history, we can't go back, and we don't know exactly how it would all end up now. But had the Catholic Church not gotten its imperial power, this governmental level of amount of power, do you think the conflict between science and religion, specifically in Catholicism and Christianity, would be so imminent? And more so, do you think the authoritativeness and the scope of the Catholic Church's power played a factor into the conflict?
Yeah, look, again, that's a really good question. And what I'd say is I think there are pluses and minuses. I mean, what lesson they got from the Galileo effect is, from the Galileo affair is, they jumped too soon, even though they had the science on their side. And this was an exercise of power that they didn't need to employ. But look, on the other side, you know, just to give you a specific example, there's a great book by the Berkeley historian John Harbron called The Sun in the Church. And that's about how the Catholic Church was the major supporter of astronomical research, you know, for centuries, right, including the period of Galileo. So this is why it's the flip side, because if the Catholic Church didn't have its political power, it wouldn't have had the capacity to be that kind of sponsor for scientific research. So you know, is it a good thing for a religious institution to exercise that much political power? I'm not going to comment on that, but I think these examples show that there are pluses and minuses. So I do think, you know, let me say just a tiny bit more. You know, I should say I'm not a Catholic, so I'm not being an apologist for Catholicism. Well, maybe I am, but I'm not. I'm not being an apologist for Catholicism when I say this, that you know, its support for educational and scientific institutions is greatly underemphasized in the history, and so I would say that. And you know, so sure, there's lots of negatives. And did the Catholic Church always exercise this power in ways that we think retrospectively were right? And the answer is clearly no, it didn't. Right. But there are some upsides and in relation to this question about science and religion. Yeah.
Hello, Dr. Harrison. Thank you for the talk. I'm a historian. And I think your question that you say that the West center science, I have a question of like one of the other reasons that they center science is around modern imperialism. So they use science and, you know, positivism to say that the colonized were inferior. So they use science not only to put themselves as superior, but also to, you know, like justify their endeavors. But I will also say that in this specific topic of colonization, science and religion work together for the West. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, no, that you're exactly right. So this, I mean, so part of what's going on is the question of the social legitimation of science, and I've given you, you know, a thin slice of history about that, which I think is right. What do we say about the role of, you know, the West? Well, look, I'd say it's the West's sense of its own superiority that is the key thing here. And in terms of, you know, in terms of the science religion thing, I think what we see happening in the history of the modern period is the West's sense of its own superiority shifting from its possession of the one true religion to its possession of the one true body of knowledge in science. I think that's the kind of transition we see. So it's not synchronous. It's more diachronical in that way. But there's lots of interesting stuff about how, in the colonial context, the two-way flows of information that made Western, you know, you might say was that the colonial enterprise gave the West the capacity to put its natural history together, certainly, I think. And you know, I think the other interesting question, which is it's far too big for us to even broach here, is, you know, what's the status of the West's? We tend to take for granted this is the best way of doing stuff, but when you look at other cultural contexts and other cultural priorities, you know, I think it's still, without going into a hopeless relativism, you know, what you see in other knowledge systems are ways of chastening perhaps assumptions that we have about the superiority of both our religious commitments and our scientific commitments. So that's just a short answer to a very interesting and complex question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. That was excellent. My question has to do with kind of this progression in natural law, or like maybe you could say like the naturalization of this natural law theory. So it seems like the way you're explaining it, it seems kind of like this slow progression of just kind of like dropping the theological elements out of natural law, but that seems to be like the authoritativeness perhaps out of natural law, because typically there's this connection between law and authority, like, you know, what makes something lawful is because the authority behind it.
Yeah.
And so was there ever any like concern about what kind of replaces the authority in this like naturalized picture of natural law when this kind of transition was being made?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and I really skated over that transition. Let me say first of all, I distinguish between laws of nature and natural law because natural law, classically refers to a particular moral position. Laws of nature in the physical sciences, and they are connected. But I think the story in the natural sciences, I don't know that it is a kind of gradual secularization. I think it's a quite sudden shift of valence, and what makes it possible, if you compare the conception of nature that we have with Aristotle, God is operating at a number of different levels in the natural world, and what is natural, I'll just stop. Let me not head down that track. I'll just say, it's a much more complex picture. What happens in the 17th century when they adopt this occasionalist voluntarist, for those of you who know those terms, understanding of the operations of the natural world, what they do is that in essence, the very subtle range of ways in which Aristotle had, under the Aristotelian system, God was operating in the world, are collapsed into this radical supernaturalism, that God is doing all the work. Now, that is a fatal step, I think, because there's a possibility for a hostile takeover where you simply redescribe that radical supernaturalism as naturalism, right? And that's what happened in the second half of the 19th century, where you've got these pious Anglicans like, William Whewell, talking about God as being the author of the laws of nature. And Huxley just says, well, we're going to have the laws of nature, thank you very much, but we don't need that. We don't need the rest of it, okay? And so it was the collapse of all causal order into this one level of causes. And it was, as I say, it was originally theological, and the naturalist says, well, we're just going to have one level of causes. There's only one world. We agree with you, but we're just going to call that natural. And that, I think, is where we're at the moment. Yeah.
I'd like to follow up a little bit. Edwin was talking, we talked about Galloway and religion. I think I mentioned your history of science presentation. When we talk about religions, but at the same time you wrote Frontiers, there's some other work out at Stanford for tithing, which was in terms of scientific spirituality. Was trying to fuse those same things. I'm curious, and you mentioned probably the punchline is secularism is probably the key thing you just mentioned. Where do you define that in that border?
Did you say?
I'm sorry, the border of somebody Tiller's work of scientific spirituality. Because your categories have religion and science, and your bridging those, and this probably gets somewhere in between Barber's work with philosophy of science. But where do you put that in this layer you mentioned earlier? Does that make that clear? Or not?
Yeah, I think so. So look, I wouldn't say there's a kind of exclusive disjunction between, a scientific approach and a religious approach. And I think one effort to blur that boundary is, say, Buddhism, which wants to aim for a kind of, non-theistic spirituality, and yet it wants to claim it's got scientific legitimacy and scientific cred. And that, the Dalai Lama is very big on that, wanting to, link the prestige of science to the philosophical sophistication of Buddhism. So that would be, conspicuous example of where, that boundary between the religious and the scientific just doesn't seem to hold up. And, can you do that in Christianity? Yes, you can. But I think for me, the question would be naturalism. And I don't think a thoroughgoing naturalism, which, to define it, denies the existence of supernatural stuff. That's not consistent with, I think, any traditional Western religious approach. And this is why I think for Western religious scientists, they adopted the opt-out clause of methodological naturalism, by which I mean, here I am, I've got religious commitments and I'm doing science, when I do my science for the purpose of the exercise, I lay aside any supernatural commitments and I do it that way, right? So in that sense, you've got with this principle of not, I'm not a naturalist, but when I do science, the method I use is naturalistic. That's a way, I think, of still preserving the distance between them in a way you don't see, say, in that comparable case of Buddhism. Now that's probably it's only a partial answer to your question, though. Yeah, sure.
I have the microphone, so I'll ask the last question. We have a little bit more time. But I encourage you all to stay if you have time and you want to see another Professor Harris. Thank you for the lecture, and you told us about some of the ways that science appeared to be in conflict in the past, but when we look closer, it's not. And then we also looked in the past about particular figures like Kepler and Boyle, who had theological values informing their own scientific practice. Are there models besides those of holding these two different practices together in terms of scientific practice or religious belief as sort of different sorts of skills or orientations toward the world or sets of practices or virtues that could be thought of as not?
Yeah, look, again, it's a great question, and it's a complicated one. I mean, and one simple answer is, if you Google, scientists who were Christians or scientists who were religious, you get a surprisingly long list of names. And going right into the 20th century, people like Heisenberg and Einstein had a kind of Spinoza's God. And so it's really quite remarkable, the persistence of religion. And clearly, you can say for these individuals, they've managed to square that circle. If it's a circle to be squared, I don't think it is, but, they've managed to hold that stuff together without any worry. But I think your point is partly about, and this is what you see in Boyle, and what Boyle is hinting at is that scientific practice is a kind of formative practice that is very close to religious practice. Okay, so that forget about the scientific doctrines and think about the processes involved, the kind of commitment, the virtues, the commitment to the search for truth. All of those kinds of things are part of a set of formative practices. And if you think about the sciences and religions in terms of that kind of thing, you get a very different sort of picture, because you're not sort of propositionalizing them in that way. And in that sense, you can say, well, actually, as practices, they might be much more similar than we had thought. I will say also, in terms of the history, if you do think about the doctrines, it's very much the sciences that are to do with the human that provide, I think, the clash points, because you often do have competing conceptions of what the human being is. I think so there is, I think, some genuine competition between naturalistic understandings of human beings that read out questions of meaning and value, and religious conceptions which want to hold on to those notions. So what you're saying gives me the opportunity to say also, what I'm not suggesting here is that there are no conflicts or potential conflicts between certain scientific doctrines and certain religious beliefs. I think there is the potential for that competition, but it's not characteristic of history as a whole. And people have managed to resolve these in the past, so they need not constitute significant barriers to reconciling those things.